Welcome back everyone to the weekly Mailbox, your chance to ask me questions about anything you would like in the world of motorsport, Formula 1, Formula E, anything in between. And if you would like to submit your questions for next week's episode, comment section down below, the community page, Twitter, Instagram, all that good stuff. And just before we dive into today's questions, a quick thank you to you guys and just the Formula 1 YouTube community in general for helping me out with a few different bits and bobs going on at the moment. If you know, you know. If you don't, do not worry. But let's jump into today's questions, the reason we're all here. And we'll start off with the question in the title coming from LV. What are the chances we might see Sebastian Vettel next year in a Racing Point? And what would it mean for his legacy if he beats both Ferraris next year? Thank you for your question, LV, and I knew this would come up. I knew this was going to be the big talking point for this week's mailbox. Number 49, we're up to now, one away from the half century. However, this has been the big news this week, which is quite surprising actually, because this weekend for the Hungarian Grand Prix, and preview will be out tomorrow, supposedly Sebastian Vettel was asked for a private interview with Martin Brundle, and that's quite rare for a driver to ask for an interview, especially with someone like Brundle and Sky Sports. So there may be some kind of announcement there. I'm not really too sure at the moment. Brundle's not too sure that there's going to be an announcement, but we'll have to wait and see on that one. But yeah, rumours this week that Racing Point have put out an offer for Sebastian Vettel and are waiting for a response. Do I think Vettel should go to Aston Martin? Well, if we've just got a clean slate, and we don't take into account the drivers already at Aston Martin, or Racing Point as they're currently known, yeah, I don't think that's a bad decision. They've made a nice little jump forward this year with the Racing Point car. They're the third fastest car, I think is more than fair to say. But I do think the one thing holding them back at the moment is their driver pairing. And that's nothing against Sergio Perez or Lance Stroll. But I think when you consider other pairings in that midfield, Sainz, Norris, Vettel, Leclerc, even to a degree Gasly, Kvyat, I think that is where Racing Point are lacking. And if they do want to make that step forward when they rebrand next year to Aston Martin, I think, yeah, they certainly should look into their drivers and consider maybe a swap. That being said, I think Sergio Perez is a great driver. Yes, he can get a little bit hot under the collar sometimes. We saw that with Esteban Ocon when he was his teammate. In Singapore 2018, I think it was, he just completely blew his top, crashed into Sergei Sorokin completely out of the blue. But when you've got Perez in a car and a situation where he's comfortable, he smashes it and can easily be the best driver in that midfield. And is one of those drivers that has proved himself so many times, more than probably anyone in the Formula 1 field. But he's the driver who's proved himself most, but never been given that opportunity at a top car, at a top team. And that season at McLaren, though they gave him a chance, it was a dead car. And that season just completely unravelled for everyone within that team. And sadly, Perez was the brunt of that. Unfairly, Perez was the brunt of that whole situation that season. So the fact that Aston Martin finally look like they're going to become a top team potentially, this could be Perez's final chance. And for me, he well and truly deserves that chance. So to bring in Vettel, someone who's coming to the end of his career, a little bit older than Sergio Perez, but he does have those 4 world titles, would certainly be a risk. It's a short-term risk, and it all would depend on how long they're going to get out of Sebastian Vettel. It also depends on how well Vettel's going to do for the remainder of this season. He's currently in 15th in the driver's standings, 1 point to his name. The start of this season hasn't been great. Out in Q2 in the first race, 10th in the second race, and Ferrari's not been great, which really isn't helping the situation for Vettel. And Seb, he's coming out of a difficult 2019, and really, Racing Point, if they did sign him, are going to have to rely on the fact they're going to be able to bring back that old Sebastian Vettel, that Red Bull Sebastian Vettel, the Vettel we saw in the first couple of years for Ferrari. So, for Racing Point, I do think it would be a big risk to take away Sergio Perez. To swap out Vettel for Lance Stroll, I think isn't a bad idea. But then we don't really know how willing the team are to do that. Of course, Lance Stroll's father, Lawrence Stroll, is the main business consortium leader of the team. However, there are other members in that consortium that also own the team, and there are other shareholders within that group, and maybe they would be able to convince Lawrence that, look, Lance, we've given him plenty of chances, and he's not quite delivering, but we're all going to have to see how well Lance does for the remainder of this season. He hasn't had the best start to the year, considering he's in the third quickest car. So, for me, it's going to be depending on whether they're going to get rid of Perez or Lance Stroll, but bringing in a driver like Vettel for a big rebrand of a team pushing for world championships in the future, isn't an awful idea. And don't worry, we'll get back to this a little bit later on with the audience participation question. However, LV does point out, what would that mean for his legacy? I think if Vettel can go to a team like Aston Martin, a completely fresh project, a team, like I say, aiming for world championships in the future, if he can go to that team and deliver that, help them really push up to the front, outperform a driver like Perez, I think that would save his legacy, which at the moment is kind of crumbling in the last couple of years of Ferrari. And if he beats the two Ferraris next year and he's in the Aston Martin, that will do him the world of good. But again, more on this a little bit later on in the episode. Question number 2, Nicholas Galea asks, having seen the first doubleheader of the season being held at the same track, which if the first being considerably more spicy than the second, do you think this will be a reoccurring theme for the other double races this season, due to the teams gathering more data and the drivers getting used to the track? An interesting one this is, and I think what's difficult here is the first race of the Austrian Grand Prix, or at the Red Bull Ring, the Austrian Grand Prix the first, the Styrian or Steiermark Grand Prix the second. The first one was made so spicy, like you say, thanks to the fact we had so many DNFs. And that could have been this weekend. We could have seen plenty of cars making contact. We could have seen drivers dropping out of the race through reliability, but it just didn't quite play out that way. And I personally think, thanks to the weather variable in that second weekend, qualifying was a hell of a lot better in the second weekend. Practice was a little bit more interesting in the second weekend. So it swings and roundabouts. Yes, there's going to be that slight factor that the drivers will get more used to the circuit, but that's not to mean we didn't see mistakes from drivers in the second weekend. We saw less mistakes, but we still saw mistakes. Russell in the race going wide at turn 5 during the Grand Prix fighting with Magnussen. We saw Stroll and Ricciardo, their little incident. Plenty of drivers doing lockups at the top of the hill. Perez and Albon making contact, with a similar incident to Hamilton and Albon the week before. And I don't think last weekend was as bad as people think it was. I think the midfield fight was great last weekend. Maybe even better than the first weekend if we hadn't have seen all those reliability issues. So when we go to circuits like Silverstone for the double header, already they're using different tyre compounds, which will make a big change and potentially could completely change strategy. We could go from a 1-stop to a 2-stop, or even a 2 to a 3-stop, something like that. They've already put that into place, so that will really help it out. But I do think as well, just the fact that it's the same circuit doesn't always, and then the drivers get used to the track, I don't think means we're going to get the same race or a more boring race, because like we saw last week, there are so many variables in Formula 1, you really just can't account for it, and very easily you could have a driver in the second race not do practice, a driver retiring qualifying. Last weekend, didn't we? We saw both racing points miles out of the way. So I'm not worried, and this was a big fear, I think, for a lot of fans coming into the season, whether it would get a little bit dull. But I loved the first 2 races in Austria, and if we did have to do a third one this weekend, I really wouldn't mind. But that's one I'd love to know your thoughts in the comment section below, because it's quite a unique question. So thank you for that one, Nicholas. Question number 3 comes from Alexander. With Renault signing Fernando Alonso for 2021, do you think Ocon could lose his seat for some Renault youth program drivers in the future? I think that's their plan. That's kind of what I've thought, because bringing in Alonso, now I've had time to think about it, I think it is the right move. They needed a big marquee signing. They needed to prove to the higher-ups, to the investors, that they've still got ambition. They still want to fight for titles. And at this stage of the season, having Ocon and then announcing a rookie driver, I think a lot of people within that team would be pretty worried. You know, it's not as if Guan Yu Zhou lit up the world last year like Charles Leclerc or George Russell did when they were in their first season of Formula 2. I love Guan Yu Zhou. I think he's got a real good chance of winning it this year. However, there is something not quite on the level of your elite drivers. There's still potential there, of course. Alex Albon struggled in his first year of F2, but look at him now in Red Bull. So certainly drivers sometimes can take a little bit of time to adapt. But from a fan and even investor perspective, that's going to be difficult to really energise your team. Having someone like Ocon, who struggled in that first weekend, did much better this weekend, but then bringing alongside a rookie, Ocon being team leader, I don't know, that just wouldn't fill me with a lot of confidence. However, bringing in Alonso is still a gamble, and I've been very vocal about that, like I think a lot of people have, and it could swing one of two ways. It could become a ridiculously toxic environment and bring the team further back down the grid, a little bit like it did with Alonso and McLaren, or it could really work out. Alonso could fit into that team fantastically, they could sort out their reliability issues, Ocon could be a great teammate, and in that instance, what you have there is a team that can afford to wait a couple of years with their junior drivers, give the likes of Lundgaard, even Zhou, opportunity to really prove themselves in Formula 2, win a title, and then move up to F1 afterwards. I mean, there's no guarantee this year that any of them are going to get enough super license points to even jump into F1 next year. So all of these questions would have been going around in Renault's heads. They would have been thinking, do we want to take that risk? Do we want to put that pressure on our young drivers? And I do think, and I still think they should have waited to assess their young drivers to see if they really could smash the title this year, to see if Gasly or Kvyat would potentially come to their team if they smash it in the midfield this year. So I certainly think they've rushed the decision. Do I think Ocon will be the scapegoat in a couple of years? I think it'll all come down to where Alonso is. I think if Fernando in 2022, the car's looking bad, still in the midfield, I think he will pack his bags and say, yeah, that's my time, thank you very much. If that's the case, I think Renault will keep Ocon. If not, and they want to keep Fernando for a couple of years, and Ocon is comfortably off the pace of Fernando, which I don't think will be the case, but if it is, I think, yeah, Ocon will be the scapegoat in that situation, and they will replace Ocon with a Renault young driver. But there's still a lot of ifs and buts here. The first couple of rounds of F2 this year are all over the place. Ferrari Junior Academy drivers doing fantastic, likewise with the Renault Junior drivers. So it's a case of we're going to have to wait and see, because there's at least 6 or 7 drivers that could win the title in F2 this year. And ultimately, we talk about this now, about it being a missed opportunity to promote a youth driver, but realistically, we could have a situation where they don't have any drivers to promote if they don't do a good enough job this year. So I'll leave that one there, because it really is a question of ifs and buts, but that's my initial thoughts. Alonso, if he decides to leave, will go. Ocon will be replaced if not. Question number 4 comes from Matt Sharp. A slightly different question, and one I think that'll catch a lot of you off guard. Do you think Hülkenberg could get the Haas seat to replace Grosjean? Roman has had a very poor start since the restart, and Hulk has proven that he's a solid driver that does a good job whatever the car. I said I think that might catch you off guard, because did anyone forget about Hülkenberg the last couple of weekends? Put your hands up, come on, be honest. And what I would say is, I'll start with this. Grosjean's start to the year hasn't been very poor. I mean, he out-qualified K-Mag in the first race of the season, despite the fact he completely missed FP1. Second race of the season, wasn't able to go out in qualifying because he had to have a new battery. In the race, did a really solid job. Started pit lane, was in that fight with his teammate and the 2 Alphas. And over on Twitter, Stuart Chainbear sent me a thing, and you may have caught it, of Grosjean's incredible overtake through the last couple of corners in Austria on one of the Alfa Romeo cars. They didn't even bother showing that. And actually, both Alphas and both Haas's had a great fight through that Grand Prix, but they don't show it. And that's kind of, it bugs me. I'm not going to lie, because I do think on face value, if you look at Grosjean's results, you'd think, oh, that's not very good. You look at Raikkonen's results, Giovinazzi's, Magnussen, you think, well, that's not very good. But on a little bit of a deeper level, what really can they do this year? Their car is 1 second slower than last year, because that Ferrari engine is 1 second slower than last year. So they've got to get to that checkered flag. But in that first race, the brakes are failing. The second race, the car's pace is nowhere. So I think to say Grosjean's had a poor start to the season is very, very harsh. But I want to talk about Hülkenberg because I have included this question for a reason. I said it last year, I said it over the winter, and I kind of want to say it again. I do think Haas need a bit of a refresh. Whether that's get rid of one of their drivers, two of their drivers, I think it is getting a little bit stale now. We've done this rodeo 3 or 4 years in a row where they want to be fighting in that midfield, but inconsistencies from both sides of the garage have really held them back. And I think in the opening 2 rounds of this year, it's probably been the most consistent either of the two Haas drivers have been throughout their time at the team. Both of them have been right on each other's pace. No matter what session, the gap between them has been hundredths. Qualifying in the first race of the season, it was hundredths to get through to Q2. Just Grosjean beat Magnussen. Second time round, qualifying, Grosjean wasn't in it. But in the race, both of them swapping back and forth position. So for once, their driver lineup finally seems to not be the issue at that team. So I'm interested to see how this is going to unfold. But I do think Hülkenberg deserves a chance. I do think he deserves a seat. But is this a year to get rid of both their drivers, considering the fact the car will be the exact same next year? Maybe that's the opportunity to bring in a driver to compare a Hülkenberg, and linking it with earlier, maybe it's an opportunity to entice a Sebastian Vettel, someone who's out the door at pretty much every team, if he doesn't get into Racing Point / Aston Martin, that is, but still wants to be in F1. Maybe that could be a great chance for them to bring on board someone like him, someone in Formula 2, a Robert Schwartzman, a Callum Ilott, some of those Ferrari juniors, Mick Schumacher even. If they can win the title, but there's no seat at Alfa Romeo, or they want a couple of Ferrari Academy drivers in F1 next year, maybe Haas could go down that route. It's too early to really make a judgment, and I have been happy with the drivers so far for this season for Haas. But I do think Hulk is a really serious option. And I think last week in German media, he was saying he's been putting out a few little notes, a few little flyers to a few teams saying, guys, I'm still here, don't worry. So it's going to be a really interesting one. But he definitely deserves his chance in F1. And if he did replace Grosjean, though, I would be very upset that Grosjean was leaving, I'm happy that a driver like Hulk got the opportunity, if that kind of makes sense. But then Ferrari Juniors as well also wouldn't bother me too much. Haas, I think, do need some kind of change within that team. And our final question, our audience participation questions, comes from Jose Portillo. And yes, it's a cheapskate question in terms of the one I chose. Nothing against you, Jose. But we're going back to Vettel, and I want to know your thoughts on Vettel because this is such a huge topic this week. And it's one where I'm just so on the fence. I'd love to know your thoughts. So, Jose asks, there are currently rumours on Vettel going to Aston Martin for 2021 and Perez is being the one replaced by him. Seb/Perez is a stronger lineup, in my opinion. What are your thoughts on next year's pairing? I kind of gave my thoughts earlier on, but just to round them up and to round off today's video, I think sticking with what they've got now will be fine, but how ambitious is that target? Is Perez going to be really pushed to his maximum if there's a driver like Stroll alongside him? Are they going to be better off bringing in a 4-time world champion like Vettel to really prove their ambitions for the future? And will Lance be able to really prove that he is ready for F1 this year? And will he be able to recover after a first and difficult couple of weekends to the season? So I'd love to know your thoughts in the comment section down below. And that is your lot for Weekly Mailbox episode 49. I'd love to know your questions for next week's episode. Comment section down below, Twitter, Instagram, all that good stuff. If you are new, consider subscribing. Red button is down below. Thank you very much for watching and I hope to see you in the next one.